He smiled like he owned the room. The grin was thin and practiced, a small barometer for entitlement. It leaned on the edge of the plate on the table as casually as a man draped over money. Richard Hale had the kind of face that suggested he'd never been asked to apologize for anything, and the diner's morning rhythm made him comfortable. Coffee refills, chipped vinyl booths, a corner near the window where he watched younger women come and go and measured whatever pleasure he could pry from the pause in their steps. Angela Brooks saw the way he looked at the young woman at the counter because she had to see it. It was a small, instinctive thing for her, more about protecting the smallest human dignity in front of her than about grand gestures. The diner was her workplace and a second skin. She knew the tilt of every mug handle, the exact time the coffee machine would hiss, the sound the front door made when the bell was loose. She also knew when someone felt watched, the way animals feel a presence behind their ear. She'd been on the receiving end of leers enough to know it wasn't harmless. "Hey, Richard," she said, not loudly, only firm enough to reroute attention. "We don't treat folks like trophies here." He turned with the slow, sulky condescension of a man interrupted. The grin deepened, as if he found her remark ineffably amusing. The young woman's fingers tightened on her phone. Someone clinked a fork against china in an awkward attempt at non-heroics. For a second, the diner held its breath. Then Richard's foot came out, deliberate as a white glove. It caught Angela's calf and sent her shoulder first into a stack of plates. They exploded like weak stars, white shards and the bright smallness of saucers throwing themselves into the air. Coffee painted an arc. For a heartbeat the room became all noise, clatter, someone's cry, the bell over the door, the hiss of the fryers. But the sound cut short, a held note that everyone let go of at the same instant. Tom Reynolds, the manager, appeared from nowhere with the precise timbre of authority that had been practiced for years. He shoved her. It was not a theatrical shove, more of a swift, habitual dismissal, the kind of hand that had turned away complaints before. His palm landed on her shoulder with the familiar friction of a man who mistook force for problem-solving. "Get the floor wiped up," he said, his voice low but carrying the heavy weight of an instruction that also meant be invisible. "You'll clean this up, Angela. We don't need a scene." Angela tasted the metal of a paperclip in her mouth from the shock. She felt the sting down her ribs where a plate had nicked her skin. She felt the indignity worse than the pain, a public erasure wrapped in a manager's routine. People looked away. The regulars resumed the mechanical act of eating as if the crash had been a small weather event in their predictable morning. Some hands reached automatically for their phones. No one stepped forward. Mary Collins, who came in every Thursday and sat at the back with her crossword, folded a bill between her fingers and slid it across under the menu. It was the smallest human thing, a quiet recognition that didn't have to be announced. Angela slid it into her palm without looking up and nearly broke into tears on the walk back to the kitchen because it meant someone had seen what had happened and understood, but also because it reminded her again of why she learned to keep certain things inside. In the corner by the window, an older man watched. He wasn't obvious at first. He wore a threadbare jacket that had once had the presence of purpose, a hat that had softened to the shape of his head, and a face that the light from the glass and the street left lined and attentive, the kind of face that gathered observations like a man collected stamps, methodically, with an unshowy patience. People like him could be ignored because they weren't loud. They would be noticed only when they decided to do something. That morning, he did not move when the plates shattered. He did not stand when Tom shoved Angela. His hand tightened around a paper cup and then relaxed. He watched the server with a kind of cataloguing attention that was not pity so much as fact. He watched the way the other patrons averted their eyes, saw the short, rehearsed apology Tom offered to Richard under his breath. He watched the grin, and something in him adjusted. Angela made it into the kitchen and leaned heavily against the counter. The smell of bacon and butter and the stainless steel cold of things clanged into the shape of her breath. She was used to bruises forming like small private maps along her forearm, and she had an internal list of reasons to smile anyway. Her son's soccer practice at 3, the rent due in a week, the slow accumulation of tips that paid for a small jar of sugar and sometimes a few extra groceries. She was used to carrying the geometry of responsibility inside her ribs. That morning, the geometry felt like a collapse. She cleaned up, attended to the cut with the slow, economical motions of someone who has learned every minor emergency herself. The towel pressed against her skin had the scent of lemon cleaner. Her reflection in the stainless steel prep table was a face with a new crescent bruise, and she felt both strangely invisible and keenly visible, like a small animal whose fur stood up on the neck when it sensed a human in the dark. Tom closed the kitchen door on the world, like people close closets to hide what embarrasses them. He moved with the practiced decisiveness of someone who gravitates toward authority, not introspection. He fumbled an apology that had the edges of a command, and left as if he was saving the diner from chaos with his hand onto the small of Angela's back. "We'll handle it," he said, more to himself than to her. Outside, the city churned on. The diner's window threw a rectangle of light onto the sidewalk, and momentarily the older man's shadow was a darker, long stripe across the pavement. He had been a presence in small-town corners for years, people said. A veteran, some muttered, a former rancher, someone who'd lived in the area long enough to know how things bent. He had a name that sounded used but respected. Some people called him simple things like Mr. Walker, though the face in the booth answered to none of the comfortable labels the regulars threw around. Nothing that morning suggested he'd be the kind of person to make headlines or calls or waves. After a while, when the first shock had damped to an ongoing hum, he stood and put money on his table. He didn't do it with the flourish of a savior. He did it as if he were returning a book that someone had left open, quietly, plainly, with no need for applause. His eyes lingered on the kitchen door as if he were making a mental bookmark, and then he left. He left his jacket on the back of his chair, like a promise. He walked out onto the sidewalk and down the block with the slow, purposeful walk of someone who had measured distances before and had decided biography could be altered by a single, small action. He stopped once under the lamplight and took out a phone and dialed a number from memory. The number, saved under a single name, was contact enough. He did not have to explain himself. He only had to move. Who he called mattered less than what he did after the call. He did not shout. He did not storm in. He did not demand retribution from the air. He used the kind of leverage a person accrued when they had years behind them, a reputation, a voice that was listened to because it had been used responsibly. He spoke to someone who could pry open institutional attention, someone with the patience to turn a complaint into a process. In his voice was the kind of calm that edges into immediate credibility. When he returned to the diner an hour later, he kept his presence contained. He asked for coffee and did not eat. He read the paper until the page blurred, then closed it carefully and left once more. He had not yet told Angela what he'd done. He wanted to be sure the call had landed. He wanted to be sure the ripple would not be a single angry splash that hit the shore and was swallowed. Angela didn't know about the call. She only knew the slow inward calculation people do in the quiet after being wronged. How to keep a schedule, where the ointment was, who would watch her son if she needed to be at school early. She reheated her coffee and went through the familiar litany of the self-sufficient. She told herself that the bruise would fade, that bills could be shuffled, that it was better sometimes to preserve a job than to turn an employer's disfavor into a fight. She had built her life on small economies like that. The diner hummed as it always did, an ordinary machine of human needs. A woman moved a high chair. A teenager paid with exact change and avoided meeting eyes. The television in the corner hummed with morning news that for a while did not notice them at all. Small acts of kindness remained, Mary's folded bills, Tom's mechanical correction of the shift schedule. Nothing seismic, nothing yet that would make workrooms shake. But ripples had been set in motion. The older man, Chuck, who had the quiet authority of a person who had been noticed and then chosen to be unnoticeable, knew that for change to happen you needed two things: attention and someone to sustain it. He was not interested in spectacle. He had no taste for dramatic scenes, staged for the thrill of watching someone fall. He wanted instead to turn attention into an instrument, a phone call that became a file that became a formal inquiry, an inquiry that forced institutions to do precisely what institutions do when the public lowers the temperature from patronizing to accountable. When his fingers touched the keypad, he thought about the men who thought a smile was the same as innocence, about the way wealth erects a kind of fragile armor around small cruelties. He thought about the long geometry of silence, how one shove gathers momentum and becomes a habit, and how sometimes the only remedy was someone's refusal to tolerate it any longer. He called a number he had kept for a long time. He asked for a favor he could not give publicly. He said the things that made officials tilt their heads. "There's been a disturbance at the 7th Street diner. A wealthy patron initiated physical contact. The manager suppressed it. The victim is a single mother." He spoke measuredly. He left facts and details. He said the name Angela Brooks. He said there was a witness. He said simply, "Please look." On the other end of that line was a man named Daniel Moore. Daniel was not a hero in an obvious costume. He was the kind of investigator who had learned to piece together patterns, to turn small incidents into files that eventually could not be ignored. He had a taste for ordnance and paperwork and the steady labor of asking questions until a story was forced into light. When Chuck, who gave his last name only after Daniel asked, and with the briefness of someone who had watched too many people demand gratitude, left a careful message, Daniel logged it. It would not sit idle on his desk. It became an entry. For Angela, the first sign that anything had shifted came in a voicemail a day later. She was wiping down the counter after a slow lunch shift when her phone buzzed with a number she did not recognize. She listened as a voice she had not expected said, "Ms. Brooks, this is Daniel Moore with the County Inspector's Office. I'm calling about an incident at the 7th Street diner. When you have a moment, please call me back." There are small moments that feel like thresholds. That voicemail was one, not a verdict, not an accusation, but an invitation out of the isolation that had been arranged for her around common daily humiliations. It offered, at the very least, the prospect that someone with a badge and a stack of official forms would listen. It also came with the quiet implication that something could happen beyond the immediate geometry of the diner. Paperwork, a file, perhaps an inspection, a check mark that meant someone had paid attention enough to make the place less hospitable to the kind of behavior that had tripped her in front of a room full of people who chose not to look. Angela sat with the warm scald of coffee in her hands and felt something loosen. Not joy exactly, not triumph, more like the uncoiling relief of a long-held muscle when it finally lets go. She did not immediately call back. Her fingers hovered over the phone, thumb pressed on the screen as if it were a delicate instrument. Memory offered the long list of consequences, the possibility of losing her job, of being labeled difficult, of being told that it was better to move on and forget. The economy had grammar rules all its own for what a person could afford to do. She thought of her son, how he would ask later that evening about the new bruise crossing her forearm, and how she would have to answer in the simplest, smallest honesty she could afford. "I'm okay. We'll be fine." Outside, the town's rhythms were beginning to shift. Rumors move like slow weather. A neighbor's nod, a mention at the hardware store. The quiet way Mary Collins began to speak Angela's name with steadier cadence when she passed in the street. Word trickled out of the diner like steam. The plates had broken, a wealthy man had smirked, a manager had pushed. Each retelling carved a slightly different shape into people's minds, some minimized, some inflated, but the kernel remained. Someone had crossed a line. Richard Hale's world did not collapse. He was a man skilled at absorbing small shocks by buying attention. He called a few people he thought would smooth things over. He texted terse notes to associates. He expected the town's natural inertia, its tendency to preserve what had power, to do the work of burying the incident under routine. He did not think he needed to apologize. His first impulse was always to protect the pattern that had favored him. But when a man with Chuck's kind of recognition nudged a process into motion, the pattern wobbled for a moment. That wobble was all it took for other things to tilt. Tom watched that tilt with thin panic. He knew perfectly well how the kitchen's economy worked. Profit margins, tip percentages, the fragile goodwill of regular customers. He also knew that management's first instinct, historically, was to suppress any item that might lead to inspection. He made contingency plans in the gaps between nervous breaths. Call corporate if required, spin a story about an accident, make Angela seem clumsy and apologize for the mess. He rehearsed 1,000 weak defenses because it was his trade to patch holes quickly and quietly. What he did not rehearse was the possibility that the silence would not hold. He had never been in a room with someone like Chuck before, someone who could rattle not with force, but with attention. He felt exposed in a way he tried not to name. He felt the small, corrosive fear that someone's quiet refusal could become a file that would not be easily shelved. For Angela, the world narrowed to the parts she could control. Call Daniel, tell the truth, plan for her son's dinner, go home and sleep. She sat at the edge of the counter and stared at the pattern of coffee rings on the formica. The bruise darkened like a comet across her forearm. She thought of how she would explain the time to her son's teacher if she had to pick him up early. She thought of the few people who had reached out. Mary, a cousin who sent a text, a neighbor who offered to take his little league practice if she needed to come to town. The small constellation of help was quiet, but real. The older man, Chuck, came back into the diner that night at closing. The light had a different tilt, the neon sign a washed-out pink at the edges. The place smelled of cold coffee and frying grease that had been left to stand. He sat in the booth near the window again, not to be dramatic, but to be present. He watched Angela from the corner in the way people watch a portrait, with endurance and a recognition of the person's full story. He ordered nothing. He nodded to Tom, who busied himself with the register as if the store's ledger could be rewritten by the action of keeping everything the same. Chuck did not offer counsel to Tom. He did not scold him. He waited until the chef called that it was closing, and then stood up and crossed the few feet separating the booth from the kitchen. He did not enter. He waited outside the swinging door until Angela emerged, towel in hand. The muscle in her cheek tightened in the way people will hold tension so it cannot be seen. "You all right?" he asked. And the question was not dignified, not theatrical. It was simply an offered truth. Angela looked at him, at his hat, his steady eyes, the small scars at the edge of his knuckles. She saw something she hadn't been expecting. The way a stranger can speak without the agenda of a friend. The way some people have no designs on making you vulnerable for their own comfort. "I'll be," she said. The phrase was not casual. It had the economy of truth, a measured enough thing to say to a man who had not saved anything but had been brave enough to notice. He hesitated then, and the hesitation was its own kind of kindness. "I made a couple of calls," he said quietly. He didn't watch her reaction. He knew that the smallness of a promise was often safer than grand gestures. "They'll listen." "Who?" Angela asked. "Because you want names when you are placing your life in somebody else's hands. You need to know whether the hands belong to a stranger who will fumble or to someone who has half a map. He said one name, Daniel Moore. He said it plainly, like inventory. He said the name in a tone that said it had weight, someone who could open a file, someone who carried the patience necessary to turn a moment into an institutional record. Angela folded the towel anew and tucked hair behind her ear. She felt the bruise, the cold of a future moment that might be kinder. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I also didn't want to walk by." There was a look he gave her then that had nothing performative in it, a face that had borne witness to things small and indignities large and had chosen to be a lever instead of a sermon. It was not pity. It was recognition. It mattered. He left a few minutes later, and Angela watched him go. She felt relief, like calm water settling after a quick storm. It was not a solution. It was a human act of refusal against the economy of silence. It was the benchmark of a possibility, that someone would insist on watching the watcher. The next day, a man named Daniel Moore called, exactly as the voicemail had promised. His questions were procedural and careful. He asked for details, times, names. He asked Angela to recount the way the grin had sat on Richard's face and how Tom had intervened, not to be prurient, but to document fact. He listened when she spoke, pausing before moving on to the next point, and when she described how people had looked away, he wrote nothing with hurried penmanship. He wrote with the careful, slow lines of someone who knew the difference between haste and accuracy. In town, conversations changed. People who had pretended not to see found they had to account for the look in their eye when they passed Angela on the street. Mary Collins told neighbors what she had seen and, in the telling, people remembered their own moments of looking away. The pattern of silence was, for the first time, interrupted. Richard Hale felt irritation first, then the ice of curiosity. He called his lawyer, not yet because he felt guilt, but because he had a calendar of reputation to maintain. He questioned the facts when he learned of a complaint. He did what men of his station did. He assumed things could be engineered back into complacency. He did not understand yet that the kind of pressure that had started was not only legal, it was social, and social pressure can be stickier than law. Tom, on the other hand, walked through the kitchen with the exacted defensiveness of a man who had misread the scale of an incident. He rearranged staff schedules and swept more carefully around the registers. He rehearsed the apology he would later give when cornered, the rituals of contrition that were cheap because they demanded little change. He was, like many in his position, more afraid of losing control over the room than of being accountable for what had taken place inside it. For Angela, the days that followed had an odd cadence, shifts filled by the predictable demands of plates and coffee, interleaved with the slow drip of callers and forms. Someone from the inspector's office asked if she would be willing to file an official complaint. There were forms, fields for dates and moments and brief narratives. There were boxes to check where dignity could be quantified, and she felt some fresh awkwardness as she learned how to translate a human wrong into legal language. She wrote a statement with the steady, decisive hand of someone who had been tired of the invisible calculus of survival. "I intervened because a woman was being looked at in a way that made her uncomfortable," she typed. Mr. Hale extended his leg deliberately. "I fell and was injured. Tom Reynolds touched me to silence me." She added small details, the sound of the plates, the exact tone of Tom's voice. She added what mattered to her. Not vengeance, but the need for the place to be safer. The investigator told her it could take time. That, the long, slow machinery of process, was not dramatic. It was paper and waiting, and if someone was persistent enough, follow-up. The reality of change was literal and administrative. Inspections, reports, perhaps training sessions required for staff. Angela had always imagined change as either an explosion or a miracle. Instead, she found it to be forms, signatures, and the way the county's clerk stamped the paper with a date like a small valve. Meanwhile, the older man, Chuck, kept showing up in small, unshowy ways. He came by to sit in the booth for a while, to leave a small envelope with a note inside that said simply, "Keep steady." He never wanted to be noticed as the savior in the story. He wanted the institutional machinery to do its job. He wanted Angela to find support among the people around her. His presence was the kind of moral pressure that made it more awkward for the regulars to find reasons not to speak. There were nights when Angela went home and let the bruise ache in the dark, and other nights when she sat with her son and counted change. The single mother has a habit of turning worry into lists. She checked that his homework was complete, that his sneakers had laces tied, that the bills were in order. There were little rituals of stability she guarded like treasure. The phone calls and the forms were a new item on that list, and she learned to fold them into the life she kept moving. Small acts began to stitch themselves into the diner, too. A new poster near the register about respectful behavior at work. A small legal-looking notice folded under the staff schedule that said an investigation was pending. A manager who learned to apologize in a way that sounded more than reflex. None of this resolved the larger questions of power and money, but it altered the landscape enough for the next person to see a different path. Yet the cost of telling the truth remained. Angela watched faces in the town blink with the discomfort that happens when someone's picture of themselves is adjusted. She watched men who had relied on small privileges twist in the attempt to keep their position. She watched Tom's brittle apologies that hid a fear of losing the control he conflated with ability. If the thing that had stood in her way had been a grin and an outstretched foot, the thing that had come in after was a slow, steady attention that would force either accountability or convenient amnesia. It would take time. It would require patience. It would require people to endure the small discomforts of being seen and called to account. One evening, a week after the plates shattered, Angela found a folded note in her apron pocket as she was leaving the diner. It read only 3 words, written in an unornamented hand. They listened. She folded it over and put it into her palm like a talisman, a small proof that something beyond herself had moved. On the street, she passed Richard Hale's car idling by the curb outside the bakery, the glass reflecting a man who preferred to be unseen. He glanced at her as she walked by, and his eyes flicked the way men like him did, measuring whether he would be inconvenienced. He could not be sure yet whether the inconvenience would amount to real trouble, and he was industrious in his defenses. That kind of unbalancing is part of what happens when decades of unchallenged behavior meet the slight pressure of attention. But the wobble is enough. The wobble opens a seam, and in that seam, things begin to shift. The old math of who could do what in the diner, in the town, in the quiet edges of everyday life begins to be recalculated. The watcher had done what watchers rarely do. He had made a call, and then he had stayed present to see whether the call bore fruit. That was the smallest kind of activism, not a headline, not a string of speeches, only the persistent refusal to let the moment pass as if it were nothing. Angela clipped the last of her apron and walked home in the thin light. The bruise ached on her arm in a way that felt close to her, like a new geography. She told herself that she was tired, but not broken. She told herself she would go back the next day because that was what she did. She kept the schedule so life could continue. But she also felt something that had not been there before, a small, cautious steadiness, like the first line of an answer to a question she had been asking quietly for years. Who will stand with the ones who are small? That night, Chuck sat in his modest kitchen and stared at a wall of pictures, some of them faded, some of them sharp, where a white-haired boy had smiled into the camera. He thought of the times he had chosen to ignore wrongs because he mistook discretion for cowardice, and he felt the old ache of having missed chances. He did not tell anyone about these photographs. He kept his life narrow and deliberate. He made a note to visit again the next morning. He was not looking for thanks. He wanted to be sure the file had been opened properly. He wanted to meet the investigator if possible and understand the shape of what had been started. For him, the pivotal moral act was not the dramatic intervention, but the sustained insistence that systems work for people, not the other way around. And somewhere between the steady turning of the investigatory gears and Angela's small household accounting of dinners and soccer practices, a different kind of rumor began, that someone with a name and a face that mattered in casual public life had paid attention. That rumor flattened the room where the wealthy once sat comfortably. It did not bring a gavel. It brought a look, the kind of look that makes a person unaccustomed to being watched take stock. It made a manager less quick to hide, and it made a waitress feel less like the room's invisible hinge. The next morning, the bell over the diner's door sounded like a threshold. Angela stood behind the counter, making coffee and listening for the small cadence of customers' voices. She felt a rawness in her side where the bruise sat. She felt a wary hope in her chest that was not yet full faith. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A number she recognized. Daniel Moore appeared on the screen. Her breath caught. She answered. On the line, the voice she had waited for said, "Ms. Brooks, I'd like to take your full statement. Will you come down to the office when you can?" She looked out the window and saw the old man's booth empty, the imprint of his jacket still warm on the seat. For a moment, she imagined that he was watching from the street, hands folded into his coat pockets. She imagined him marking the moment in his own quiet ledger. "I can be there," she said. The word traveled through her like a small proof. She hung up and smoothed her apron with both hands, as if preparing a flag. She had told the truth to a room, and now she would tell it again into a different kind of place where words became records. The process would be slow. It might be messy. It might only lead to paperwork and a requirement that a manager attend sensitivity training. It might lead to hostility. It might do nothing at all. But it would no longer be only silence. Behind her, the lunch rush began to assemble. Workmen speaking in the clipped language of the day, a student with headphones, Mary Collins arriving at her usual table. The diner filled its familiar small noises, and Angela carried with her the new weight of being witnessed by things larger than her immediate world. On the street, a car idled with a man inside who checked himself in the window's reflection and adjusted the way his smile rested on his face. He was the sort of man who could assume a shrug would suffice. He had not yet learned the cost of those shrugs. And in a small house not far away, an older man, who people would later name in stories for reasons they did not yet understand, sat down at his table and took from a drawer a folded note he had written that first night. He thought about the long arc of accountability. He did not expect fireworks. He only expected persistence. Angela locked the back door behind the last customer. The sign on the window said "closed," but the day had already altered its course. The plate fragments were cleaned and boxed away. The bruise on her forearm throbbed like an honest alarm. She gathered her purse and her courage and stepped into the bright, indifferent street. As she walked, she felt the town shift minutely around her. The slight alteration in how people met her gaze, the extra courtesy at the crosswalk, a man who held the door for her without being asked. None of it erased the morning. None of it settled the larger debts. But like the first small constellations of stitches over a wound, the gestures began to form a pattern that might hold. She kept her head down, because habits are hard to shed, and she was careful by necessity. She kept going. The investigator's office waited, a place of linoleum, and a receptionist who smelled faintly of hand cream and printer toner. It was a world of forms and measured questions, and the slow making of records. Inside, a clock tapped minutes and no one was particularly grand. The machinery of attention had finally engaged. It was not spectacular. It was not a headline. It was a phone call, a form, a man who watched and stayed. And when Angela sat down in the small, hard chair across from Daniel Moore, something unspoken passed between them. The knowledge that the first step had been taken, that the space of silence had been cracked open. It was far from a victory, but it was not nothing. Outside the window, the street moved on. People carried groceries, coffee cups, morning papers. Somewhere in the town, a man named Richard Hale smoothed his jacket and wondered how much trouble might come from a woman he had tripped in a diner. The watcher, the man who had decided not to let the event pass, watched the town too. He did what watchers sometimes do after they make a choice. He kept an eye on the road and prepared for the long distance that justice so often turns out to be. He did not expect miracles. He expected work, and that expectation was enough to begin. When Angela gave her statement, her voice was steady. She told the plain sequence of events, the leering, the admonition she gave, the deliberate leg, the crash, the manager's shove, the hush of the room. Daniel wrote it down. He asked questions that invited the sharp details and left out commentary. He submitted the page into the slow gears of the county system. It filed as an incident report. It filed as an incident report. The paper sat in a county file like a small, stubborn seed. It had Angela's name typed in block letters and Daniel Moore's neat notes attached. Dates, times, witness accounts, the shorthand of a bureaucracy that moves slowly but with the authority of procedure. Filing meant something. It meant the moment could not be entirely forgotten. It meant box numbers, reference codes, and an official line connecting a complaint to an office that would, if pressed, send an inspector with a clipboard and eyes trained to look for patterns. For Angela, the file was both relief and a fresh series of anxieties. A piece of paper could be a rope or a chain. She felt the tug toward safety and the tug toward consequences she had to pay for telling the truth. She left the office with a stamped receipt and the peculiar feeling of walking with a modest, institutional weight in her pocket. Outside, the day was bright, and the sunlight cut the street into flat panes. People carried their mornings as if nothing had happened in the small places between their tasks. Back at the diner, the thrumming of the griddle and the low hum of conversation continued. Only a few things had visibly changed. A laminated notice slid into the employee handbook about workplace conduct, a new box of disposable gloves in the prep area, a discreet sign near the door describing channels for complaints. These were small, administrative stitches. For people used to the economy of quiet compromises, they were almost invisible. For Angela, they were necessary first steps. Investigations do their work by accrual. Daniel visited the diner twice in the first week. He arrived in a sensible jacket, a folder under his arm, and a pen that never seemed to lift in haste. He interviewed staff separately, then together, then the regulars who might have seen or heard something. Mary Collins told him what she had done, the sliding of the bill, and how the room had gone thin with sound after the crash. Other patrons who had been sitting with their coffee were more reluctant, remembering polite smiles and the cost of being labelled a troublemaker. Some described only the clatter, some said they'd noticed the manager's movement. Daniel wrote everything down in patient lines. He asked the kinds of questions that turned gossip into evidence. Exactly where did Mr. Hale sit? At which point did Tom touch Angela? Which plates broke and how many were replaced that day? He asked for CCTV if the diner had any. The owner replied they had an old camera that rarely recorded more than the door area. The footage was grainy, but sometimes the grain was enough. Outside the thin world of the diner, conversations grew more deliberate. Karen Lewis, who ran a small local non-profit focused on workplace rights, read Daniel's preliminary notes after he showed them to her. She called a meeting at the library and put out chairs quietly, like a person arranging seating for a small funeral of civility. Women came. Some brought their own stories folded into their hands like letters they had never mailed. There were younger servers from other kitchens and a schoolteacher who wanted to know how institutions protect people who work in public-facing jobs. They listened to Karen and to each other. They decided to draft a short petition asking for a formal review of the diner's policies and for staff training. It was not dramatic. It was a list of requests with dates and signatures. When word reached Richard Hale, his first move was the one many people with his kind of resources make. He called an associate in public relations and asked for containment. He called Tom almost immediately after, not to apologize, but to make sure the narrative would be managed. "Keep calm," he told him. "We don't need headlines." He asked if the insurance could cover replacement plates, if a written statement from staff could be arranged, if there was a way to show remediation. He did not yet consider the idea that attention itself could be the lever. He kept his hands precisely where the calendar of his social appointments had taught him to hold them. Tom moved, like someone relearning how to be cautious. He practiced apologies into the mirror at home that sounded like other people's apologies, words with the edges cut off so they wouldn't demand change. At work, he watched the staff more closely. Anxious gestures misread as defiance, and tightened the roster until the kitchen felt smaller and more controlled. He began carrying the narrative of the accident as if it was a fact he could shape. A slip, a clumsy fall, a misunderstanding. He practiced the institutional response that had kept his shifts straightforward for years, but containment requires more silence than the town was ready to give. The watcher's call had loosened the knot. Daniel opened his file and followed the thread. He wrote a notice to the county licensing board requesting a standard inspection of the diner's compliance with workplace regulations. He filed requests for witness statements and for any documentation that showed managerial procedures for handling customer disputes. Each piece of paper was a measured turn of a wheel. The inspector arrived on a wet Wednesday, the air smelling like ozone and fry oil. She was precise, carrying a clipboard and measuring tape. She spoke to the owner and to the staff, inspected the prep areas and the storage of cleaning supplies, and asked about employee training. She asked with a neutral face what protocols existed for dealing with customer aggression. The answer, no formalized training in the last 5 years, was an awkward silence. The inspector took notes and left a copy of the inspection checklist. There would be a follow-up meeting, she said. The report might recommend training, perhaps a requirement for documentation of customer complaints. It was the type of administrative pressure institutions feel, steady, formal, and complicit in making people accountable through the slow work of oversight. As the institutional machinery began to hum, pressure seeped into the social fabric. Karen's petition gathered signatures. Local columnists ran careful pieces about the economics of silence and the responsibility of businesses to protect employees. A small blog that had previously covered farmers' markets and high school sports published a feature that quoted Daniel's notices and spoke with Maria, a line cook who had once been dismissed when she raised concerns. The story didn't need sensational headlines to matter. It mattered because it asked a town to measure itself. In the middle of it all, Chuck, who had begun the sequence with the quiet call, did what he had decided to do. He stayed unshowy, but consistent. He continued to sit in the booth by the window some mornings, quietly present, reading the paper and keeping watch. He attended the library meeting for a few minutes, and then left without comment. Once, when Angela had a break between shifts and sat in her car to catch her breath, he pulled up in a borrowed sedan and rolled down his window. He offered her nothing dramatic. He handed her a small envelope with an official-looking card of support inside, an offer to speak as a witness to Daniel if needed, and a note that said simply, "I will be where I can be." His presence mattered because fame can be a lever. It can make an inspection that might otherwise be brushed past carry more weight. People with platforms, if they choose to use them, can create an audience around something that would have remained invisible. Chuck used his quiet presence in precisely that way. He made phone calls that asked officials to pay attention without spectacle. He wrote a short letter to the local paper about the basic dignity of people at work. He did this not to make a hero story of himself, but to convert his recognition into pressure that moved institutions rather than people. The first formal hearing was scheduled almost 2 months after the plates shattered. It was not a courtroom drama. It was an administrative proceeding held in a nondescript room with linoleum floors and folded chairs. The hearing brought Daniel and the inspector, Tom, and the owner, Richard Hale's representative, Angela, and a few witnesses. Karen organized a small group of supporters who came as a visual reminder that the room's decisions would ripple outward. Walking into the hearing, Angela felt oddly steady. She had rehearsed the retelling not as a speech, but as the plain facts of a morning. What had been said, what had been done. Daniel stood at the front and read the facts into the record. He asked her to speak. Her voice did not waver as he asked the sequence carefully. She spoke in measured sentences, the cadence of someone who had practiced making lemonade out of finance and routine. "He leered at the woman," she said. "I told him we don't act that way here. He put his foot out. I fell. Tom touched me in a way to stop me from speaking." She named things plainly, without flourish. The room listened. Tom's defense was not dramatic. He said he had tried to manage an incident in the heat of a busy morning. He admitted the contact, but called it a mistake, a misjudged shove to steady, not to silence. His face had the pallor of a man who suddenly understood that a habitual act could be interpreted as wrongdoing. Richard's representative framed Mr. Hale's action as an accident, a misunderstanding amplified by the current climate. The lawyer asked for caution in interpretation. They produced a handful of statements from regulars who described Richard as a quiet man and never violent. The lawyer's task was to turn a deliberate gesture into ambiguity. Mary Collins and a few others presented their accounts. Mary described sliding the bill and how the room had quieted. "It was like something inside the room stopped breathing," she said, and the image cut through the procedural language of the hearing. Her words had the power of small clarity. People should not be taught to look away. Karen spoke about patterns, about how social tolerance compounds into institutional failure, and handed a stack of signatures to the clerk. Then Daniel asked Tom to reflect. The question was simple but heavy. Why had he touched Angela? Tom's face, which had earlier been composed by routine, broke in a way that was not theatrical. He swallowed, and his voice came out thin. "I panicked," he said. "I thought wrongly that keeping things quiet would be better for the business. I wanted to fix the mess. I grabbed her because I wanted to move the cleanup along, and I didn't want a scene." He sounded like a man confessing not to malice, but to cowardice. "I should have spoken up. I should have protected her." That admission, phrased as contrition, not spectacle, changed the tenor of the hearing. It allowed the proceeding to be less about proving malicious intent and more about acknowledging duty. The hearing panel discussed remedial steps, mandatory workplace conduct training, revised complaint procedures, and a probationary oversight period for the diner's management. They recommended that the county's employment services offer mediation and that a follow-up inspection be scheduled. They left the door open for civil suits. They noted that criminal investigation could be considered if additional evidence emerged. No gavel dropped. No criminal verdict was issued that day. There were, however, consequences: oversight, mandates, and an official record that would not disappear. Richard Hale's name appeared in the record as a person of interest in a pattern of uncomfortable encounters. That wording did not equate to a criminal indictment, but it made the social cost real. Men like Richard were used to sliding their tongues through shades of ambiguity. The formal record required more precision. He felt the new awkwardness of being a subject of official scrutiny. He began to find fewer reflexive apologies that managed everything. The world he expected to lubricate with his wealth and influence required now more careful attention. The weeks after the hearing were filled with the slow, administrative grinding of change. Trainers came in and spoke to staff about reporting procedures. The owner posted a new poster in the employee area that described channels for complaints. The diner's insurance company required a review of policies. Daniel kept in touch with Angela, checking on her well-being and ensuring the follow-up inspections were conducted. Karen and her group held a community forum where residents could discuss workplace dignity and mediation. The forum had the modest air of a town meeting. People came, used their real names, and spoke without theatrics about the small ways power is often exerted in public spaces. At the diner, things were different in ways that counted. The manager no longer made decisions in private. There was a new staff meeting once a week where concerns could be voiced. The customer area had a simple sign by the register reminding patrons of expected conduct. A young server who had previously avoided confrontation found herself backed by a more explicit set of protections that made her feel less alone. Customers, some of them regulars who had once practiced the economics of quiet acquiescence, began to shift their behaviors. They no longer turned away as reflexively. A woman at the counter who once hurried out when men lingered to look now met their gazes and stayed. For Angela, recovery was not cinematic. It was incremental and practical. She sat with a counselor a few times, and more importantly, she kept her son's routine intact. He talked about a game at school and the small victories of practice. He noticed the new bandage of tenderness on her wrist and asked if she was okay. She answered simply, "I am getting steadier." She returned to work on schedule. When customers leaned into their old patterns, she found herself more likely to call it out now, and sometimes a manager would step in. Being witnessed had taught her a new measure of how to hold space for herself. There were moments of strain. Richard sent a terse letter through his legal counsel, pushing back against the suggestion of pattern and threatening to sue for defamation if the diner allowed unfounded statements. The owner, who was not wealthy, found the legal tone threatening. He hired counsel, who advised prudence and eventually accepted the recommended oversight rather than engage in a costly fight. The possibility of legal actions lingered like weather on the horizon. Civil claims pending, investigations open. It was the kind of unsettled resolution that does not end stories so much as move them into new phases. Tom, after the hearing, took a leave of absence. He admitted to Daniel and to Angela that he had been wrong. He attended the required sensitivity sessions and wrote a brief apology that he read to the staff one morning with a voice that trembled at the edges. Some employees accepted it, others remained cautious. The work of rebuilding trust would not be completed by a single statement. That was the point the staff discussed in their weekly meetings. Trust is not a speech, but a pattern of behavior. Chuck's role remained modest but meaningful. He attended the hearing not as a celebrity spectacle, but as a quiet witness. He sat near the back, hat on his lap, and left without comment afterward. He did not wave at cameras. He gave no interviews that sought to make him the center. In small ways, he continued to use his reach, making calls that nudged officials to review reports, writing a short note that he asked a friend to post to a local listserv, urging people to support the diner's staff while the process moved forward. He made a point of not eclipsing Angela's voice. For him, the moral calculus was simple. Presence that amplifies someone else's story without converting it into your own. As months passed, the town's public memory softened the raw edges of the morning's violence, but the institutional changes remained. Certified training in conflict de-escalation, a documented complaints log, and an agreement that the diner would participate in a county workplace safety audit in 6 months. These were concrete adjustments, mundane, administratively satisfying to those who had watched the system work, and they mattered because they made the environment less hospitable to the small violences that had once sailed under the radar. There were private reckonings, too. Richard Hale, who had earlier relied on social patterns to smooth away discomfort, found his calendar subtly altered. Invitations he had expected began to look different. Some acquaintances stopped accepting calls. He learned the social cost of being linked, even indirectly, to conduct that a community would not tolerate. For him, the uncomfortable lesson was that a public eye can be as relentless as a legal one. Angela's arc, if it had a shape, was not one of triumph, but of steady reclamation. The bruise faded. New small markers took its place. A smile from Mary over coffee, a mother at the counter who explicitly thanked Angela for speaking up, a youngster who saw a woman refuse the role of being invisible and thought maybe he should notice when someone else needed help. Angela kept her job and found in her cautious courage a new kind of quiet authority. She set small boundaries and found that some people respected them. She began to save a little more each month. She went to one community meeting where Karen read letters from other workers, and she sat near the back and listened, realizing that her single act had seeded other acts. There was a day, late in the summer, when the county's inspector returned. She walked the floor with a different look, the trained eye that watches whether change has stuck. She checked the complaint log, asked how staff had been trained, and confirmed that the diner had followed through with the recommended steps. There were items to correct, more signage, a clearer reporting method for night shifts. But the change was marked. The inspector signed off on a provisional compliance. It was a small administrative victory, but victories in administrative languages are durable in ways that media storms are not. On a quiet Tuesday, with sunlight slicing the diner's windows into warm rectangles, Chuck came by one last time with a plain envelope. He left it with Angela at the end of her shift and walked out before she had a chance to open it. Inside was a handwritten note and a small check, enough to cover a month's rent if she needed it, and a sentence, "Keep steady. If you need a witness, say only the truth and trust it to stand." She folded the note into her palm, a private object now. She felt the small gnaw of gratitude and an equally small resistance to being owed anything. She had not sought charity. She had sought a life in which dignity could be reclaimed by rules and community. The money would help, and the note was a reminder. Someone had watched and would not walk away. In the weeks that followed, the diner's cadence softened. People were more likely to speak. New hires learned of the complaint log before they learned the regulars' names. The manager, back from leave and under watch, kept his hands to himself and learned to use his words. He apologized to Angela again, this time not as an immediate maneuver, but as part of a longer, awkward attempt to rebuild the room he managed. Whether complete forgiveness came was uncertain, and not every relationship returned to its prior shape. Some people stopped coming in at all, and that loss was part of the cost of change. The town, in its small civic ways, recalibrated. The pattern of bystander silence loosened because a few people practiced a different script. Karen's group met monthly to offer support to service workers. A local high school senior working a summer job in the diner told his parents one night about how he had once ignored someone who fell at a party. He told them he would do differently now. The change was not total. It was a series of small adjustments that, over months and years, reshaped the social architecture. Angela's son grew taller and practiced soccer in a field that smelled like cut grass and sweat. He asked her questions about fairness in the way children ask them, simple, direct. She answered with the same practical honesty she had used in the hearing. People should be treated with respect. Sometimes people make that hard. We tell the truth, and we ask for help. Her answers were the small curriculum she had to teach him, because the world did not hand lessons about dignity to children in neat packages. There remained the jagged edge of fear. A few nights she woke with the memory of the plates falling, and the sound of coffee hitting laminate. Sometimes she took extra care with door locks. Those habits did not make her less brave, they made her human. Courage in her evidence was not absence of fear, but the willingness to keep living with the fear and to make choices anyway. Months later, when someone in the diner told the story of the morning the plates broke, people no longer treated it as a peculiar scandal, but as a town event that had moved the machinery of institutions. Chuck's name came up sometimes in that telling, and when it did, it was not with the heat of celebrity gossip, but as an artifact of how attention can be used. People referenced him the way they referenced other parts of the story. Those who watched, those who spoke, those who made the calls that turned events into records. It was not a tale of a single savior. It was a map of small acts, layered one on another. The final formalities were gentle in their legality. The owner agreed to keep the diner's training records current and to participate in community forums. Tom's return came with a stipulation. If further complaints were lodged, he would be reassigned pending review. Richard Hale faced civil inquiries and the quiet social frictions that follow public attention. Legal counsel and reputation management became a pattern of his days. The systems had been nudged, the wheels had turned. Nothing miraculous had solved everything. The changes were administrative, social, and slow, just the way durable repair often happens. On an ordinary morning, some months after the incident, a young woman sat at the counter and felt, for the first time in a while, a quiet assurance that someone would speak up if needed. She glanced toward Angela and saw a nod, the small human signal of solidarity. It was hardly noticeable, but it was enough. The diner's bell chimed and the room breathed. Angela still kept her apron in the same place. She still felt the bruises in memory, like geography. She still had to do the calculus of rent and school clothes and small mercies. But when she looked in the diner's stainless steel reflection, she saw a woman whose voice had been put into the world, and the world, for its part, had not been silent. The watcher, Chuck, continued his small pilgrimages to the diner for a time, then less often. He did not seek acknowledgement. He had learned, as he told no one, that the important thing was that someone had refused to look away. He had turned his recognition into an instrument of attention that had threaded a file into an office and a phrase into a record. That was enough for him. In the quiet that followed, the town learned a small lesson about the cost of silence and the power of attention. It learned that dignity is not granted by wealth or position, but practiced in small, habitual acts. It learned that institutions respond when attention becomes a file and a file becomes an obligation. It learned that ordinary people, when they speak, can change the mechanics of their lives and build protections for others. When the diner's sign was washed and a new barista learned to steam milk without spilling, Angela served a man who had once been one of the regulars and who now looked at her with something like apology in his eyes. She simply refilled his coffee. He paid, left a tip, and walked out into the light. For a moment, the room felt like a place that had been tested and found workable. Later that evening, as she closed up, Angela thought of the morning the plates had fallen. She thought of Tom's shrug and of Mary's small paper currency, of Daniel's patient questions, of Karen's quiet group, and of a watcher who had made a few calls that set the rest of the work in motion. She thought of the long, unromantic action of paperwork and inspections, and the way those ordinary tools had become the instruments of a larger justice. She folded her apron and put it on the hook. She locked the door and stepped into the street. For all the things that did not change overnight, one thing had. The equation that had once made small violences easy had shifted. The town's moral balance had reweighed itself, not with punishment, but with an insistence that dignity be preserved by policy, by community attention, and by the simple courage to speak. She walked home under streetlights that painted the pavement in long, bright stripes. Her son would be waiting with a bowl of something she had promised him, and whatever small victories or defeats came in the morning, They would face them together. The bruise on her arm had faded to a pale memory. The sense of being seen had hardened into a quiet strength. At the end of her block, she paused and took out the small note Chuck had left. She read the words again. "Keep steady." She smiled to herself, not because the world was solved, but because she could feel the texture of the next day. A day where she would wake up and return to work and know that a file existed that carried her truth. That file had a name and a date and a series of signatures. It was paper, but it was a kind of promise. If this story matters to you, consider subscribing for more stories about everyday courage and how quiet acts can move systems. The man who had once smiled like entitlement was still a complication in the town's life. He walked a little more carefully in public, aware now that his gestures might be read differently. Some of his allies remained, some did not. Life, after all, contained the slow negotiation of human stubbornness and institutional insistence. In the months and years that followed, the diner continued to be a small hub where people's lives intersected. The clang of plates and the hiss of coffee machines kept the time. People argued about politics and sports and holidays and bills. But the space where small violences once slid by unnoticed had a new guardrail. A community more willing to look, a system more willing to record, and a culture less practiced in walking away. Angela learned to be steady. She learned the tense arithmetic of being a single mother and a worker and a citizen. She learned that courage is not always a speech or a headline, but a series of small refusals to tolerate harm. She taught her son, in the ordinary ways of making dinners and fixing shoelaces, that dignity is a daily practice. The watcher, who had once sat in a booth and decided not to close his eyes, continued to live quietly in the town. People would later tell the story of a celebrity who stepped into a small place and used attention to open a file. They would tell how the man called an investigator, how the inspector came, how the hearing unfolded. They would tell not as a single tale of rescue, but as a composite of small agencies colliding with an old pattern and bending it toward accountability. And when the story was told, people would sometimes speak with a modest reverence about the way a single decision, the choice not to ignore, had made a paper trail that altered the social math. That was the quiet center of it, attention converted into process, a person's refusal to look away, turning into the machinery of oversight. It was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was stubborn, administrative, communal work. On the last page of her notebook, where Angela kept the receipt from the county office, she had written one line months earlier. "I told the truth." Beneath it, she had added another, in smaller letters. It traveled. The diner's bell chimed the next morning, as if nothing miraculous had happened. But inside the room, people met each other with the very small respect they owed one another. The plates were whole, the coffee hot, the work steady. The world did not look wholly redeemed, but certain calculations had changed. The ledger of everyday dignity had acquired a new column. Angela walked in, tied her apron, and began her shift. Outside, life moved on. Inside, a woman who had been tripped by a wealthy man and shoved by an authority had the steadiness to serve plates again. She carried, like everyone does, the evidence of what had been and the knowledge of what might be. She had, in the end, turned a small personal fracture into a communal change. If this moved you, share the story with someone who should know how a few people's small choices can add up to real accountability.